Hello again, and welcome to Tuesdays with Lloyd's, an ongoing virtual conversation with Lloyd's underwriters and their distribution partners in London and the US. I think you'll find that our topic for today is very timely. It seems the daily news cycle is filled with stories relating to geopolitical instability, political unrest and upheaval, and even military conflict. So today's title card really says it all: Geopolitical Risks in a World of Extremes. We have an outstanding panel of experts today, and our moderator will be Evan Freely, President, Americas, and Director from BPL Global. Before we kick off, just a few reminders. We encourage you to submit questions during the session, which we will cover near the end, but please do use the Q&A tool instead of the chat box. Our sessions are streamed live on Lloyd's YouTube channel, and today's installment will add to our growing library of specialist topics, including nearly every Tuesdays with Lloyd session to date, all available for on-demand viewing 24/7. So be sure to check that out and refer it to your colleagues. And with that, let's get started. Evan, over to you.
Thanks, Pat, and thanks to Lloyd's America for inviting us to present today the key challenges on potential solutions to protect against political violence perils. Again, I'm Evan Freely. I'm based in New York. I'm a director at BPL Global. We're a credit and political risk specialist broker. That's all we do. And today I'm joined by three panelists. First is my colleague, Zoe Towndrow. I think, Zoe, you need the camera on there so we can see you. There you go. Good. Want to make sure you have that nice map and BPL logo behind you. Zoe is our practice lead for political violence cover. Left to right in the same room, we have Joanna Hitchcock, who's underwriting manager, terrorism, political violence at the Talbot Syndicate, which is an AIG company. And then Sophia Cartmell, political risk underwriter at Inigo, Syndicate at Lloyd's. So before I pass it over to the panelists, I thought I'd just mention a few things about the market and what's going on in the world, just to kind of frame today's conversation. Thankfully, large terrorism events, which typically target city centers, have subsided to a certain extent. Still a risk, but at the same time, there have been a lot of civil commotion, demonstrations, riots, vandalism, and that the number, scale, and duration have increased in that area. So that's a concern for not only risk managers, but the underwriters as well. And these civil unrest, civil commotion events have led to claims in the market, not just property damage, but loss of revenue, BI type coverages. So for example, Colombia, Chile, and Hong Kong in 2019, the Yellow Vest protests in France in 2018 to 2020 spanned 3 years almost. And those of you in the US obviously know about the George Floyd demonstrations and riots, which spanned 20 different states in the US and were often outside of city centers. And then lastly, large losses in the market in South Africa with riots. So you see, these are mostly riots, civil commotion losses. And the claims has put some pressure on pricing and capacity in the market, as you would expect. So today's risk managers, it's not surprising, are finding it hard to figure out where these events will manifest and then what form they'll take. Triggers have been social inequality. If you look at Chile, infringement on civil liberties in Hong Kong, social injustice with the George Floyd riots, accusations of election fraud here in the US, military coup, and now war in the Ukraine. So the spectrum of perils is pretty wide, and triggers, of course. So today we'll explore how risk managers, with the help of their brokers, of course, can at least control what they buy as far as coverages, breadth of coverage geographically, and the contract wording, which is extremely important. We'll explore the policy itself, some of the perils, state of the market, and how Lloyd's can add value in this area. So we'll start with Zoe, who's typically in London, but I think she's having a nice holiday in Scotland right now. And I think, Zoe, you'll go through some of the different perils that comprise political violence, which we call PV, and political risk. So Zoe?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you, Evan. So what I really wanted to kick off with was the fact that actually this is quite a tricky topic. It's not as simple as people think. And when you start to talk about political violence or even political risk, people tend to be distracted and think it's either terrorism or war. But actually, it's a huge range of perils in between. Now, risk managers who buy a property program will be probably used to having some terrorism cover, some cover for strikes, riots, civil commotion. It may be cancelable, it may be sublimited, it may have all kinds of restrictions, it may be a right back of an exclusion, all kinds of things. Now, the PV spectrum in its own right is an interesting thing, and that's what I wanted to look at first. So have a look at what we're putting on the screen. So this is the political violence spectrum, as we call it, and it goes really from left to right. The whole thing can start with any kind of small issue, small social issue, and it literally, and any event you can think of can potentially run straight through, and something that starts off as disobedience can end up being war, civil war. In a matter of weeks, days, months, all this can happen very, very quickly. So when you look at something like this, the first point to make is it's very difficult to put causes of loss in a separate box. Now, they are in a separate box on here, but there's very much a kind of arrow leading from one to the next, because when you're in a very turbulent political climate, the risk of contagion and escalation is huge. So you can't just view these separate perils as separate individual things. So this kind of thing works better really with examples. So the first example I want to give you is the Arab Spring. So if you apply the spectrum to that, you see that an act of disobedience ran straight through the spectrum and became effectively civil war which affected Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, very, very quickly. So a market trader, well, he was actually a graduate, Mohamed Bouazizi in Tunisia, set himself on fire because he was not allowed to sell his wares, he was unemployed. This escalated far beyond everyone's belief and far beyond everyone's imagination. Okay, so that's the Arab Spring, but if you're in the States, you're probably thinking, well, what has that got to do with me? So what I will do now is talk about a second example, which is much closer to home. So last week was the 4th of July. So let's talk about the Boston Tea Party. Now, the Boston Tea Party was in 1773 and was effectively another act of disobedience. It started by a group called the Sons of Liberty throwing tea chests into the sea as a reaction, a protest to heinous punitive taxation by the British. And there was actually a catchphrase at the time, which was no taxation without representation, became like the Twitter hashtag, if you like, of its day. So 340 tea chests thrown into the sea. Try and apply that to the spectrum. It's impossible. It was disobedience, it was malicious damage, oh, it was civil commotion, terrorism. Well, the Sons of Liberty could have been considered terrorists, depending on your point of view. Mutiny, coup d'etat, insurrection, revolution, rebellion led to the shot heard around the world, which was actually the phrase refers to the opening shot of the battles of Lexington and Concord in April 1775, which started the American War of Independence. So you can see, I know it's a leap, but the Arab Spring and the American War of Independence have one big thing in common. They were both started by social disobedience, a protest against what was happening in the country at the time. And this links a lot to what Evan was just saying about social unrest being rife around the world for lots of reasons. Now, escalation, contagion, are words that we really need to think about here when purchasing cover. You always need to purchase the widest cover. And that's why this market is here, because we are a specialist political violence market. So whereas you can buy some of these perils, usually malicious damage, riot, strike, civil commotion, and terrorism within your property policy, there is a whole market that will aggregate them absolutely separately and will write them properly, because anything that's added into a property policy tends to be a write back. It tends to be something which is a good idea at the time. Now we're finding more and more carriers, as Evan mentioned, the Chile riots, more and more carriers are starting to remove riot strikes and civil commotion from their property offerings anyway. After 9/11, a lot of carriers removed terrorism. So this is where the standalone market comes into its own. We can cover all of the perils, which are basically shown on the screen, and we do. And when you're in a situation where you don't want to ever be guilty of what I would call a failure of imagination, just remember, escalation, contagion can happen absolutely anywhere and in any situation. I'll hand back to you, Evan. That's just really what I wanted to say about it.
Thank you, Zoe. Yeah, you can see the spectrum of coverages and the complexity, even within each peril, I think is important to understand. So maybe we can dig into that a little bit later, but thanks, Zoe. I think we're going to move to some events which are taking place today, which may impact risk as well as the market overall. So I think, Sophia, you're going to take this topic.
Thank you, Evan, and thank you, Zoe. Yeah, so I'm going to start by talking about the announcement that came out 3 weeks ago on the overturning of Roe versus Wade. Straight away, we saw demonstrations kind of quickly spring up across the nation, with thousands of people either kind of grieving or celebrating the results. And even 4th of July, the top Instagram GIF was on protesting in America, which was very interesting to see. Also, within the market, we use a company called IHS, which rates out the civil unrest index across multiple countries. And focusing in on America, immediately their civil unrest score jumped from what was 3.3 in November, jumped to 3.6 early June, and straight after the announcement to 3.7, which is deemed very high. And it was predicted that there were going to be frequent protests across the states as the states react to the ruling. To put that into context, during the October 2019 riots that Zoe and Evan mentioned in Chile, their score was rated a 3.1. So a vast kind of, not improvement, but deterioration on what Chile was rated, seen in the US. And again, going back to some other civil unrest within the US, Black Lives Matter movement saw 140 cities across 21 states see civil unrest. It cost the insurance market over $2 billion. And following that, as Zoe mentioned earlier, a lot of the all-risk markets kicked out their riot cover, leaving a lot of kind of insureds with no cover at all, or leaving it silent within the policy, which gives the insured a completely grey area and kind of no set determination on what cover they have, which within this day and age is not a safe place to be. Following on from that, I was just going to mention one other factor that we've seen as a big catalyst within the SRCC world at the moment, which is climate change. It's been a threat multiplier and really has kind of been seen to exacerbate tensions. So looking back to Syria in 2011, it was due to a lot of kind of droughts that saw a number of people having to move from the outer areas into the city, which led to a huge strain on resources within the city, as there were also a number of refugees having moved in due to the war in Iraq. Again, going to Africa, we mentioned South Africa, sorry, we mentioned earlier that there had been significant civil unrest there. There was also Storm Isa in April just gone, which displaced over 40,000 people near Durban. And again, this was due to a magnitude of flooding that had never been seen before, unparalleled levels of flooding. I think more rainfall fell within one day than within a year, which has been utterly devastating. And bringing it closer to home, within California, there's been disputes over water rights in Northern and Southern California. Long-standing law decrees over water diversions from the Sacramento San Joaquin Delta watershed to the, I hope I pronounced this correctly, to Hibachi Mountains has been a huge issue. And if that lack of water continues in 2022 and 2023, it is expected that it will lead to high stakes political and legal conflict. So you might think, how does climate change impact the political violence market? Well, there's several reasons as to how it does and why it does. And I'll now pass you over to Joanna, who's going to discuss a couple of other subjects.
So another major issue we're being faced with at the moment is the increased cost of living. So all around the world, inflation is crushing living standards, fostering turmoil. If the ramifications of COVID weren't enough, then Putin's recent invasion of Ukraine has sent food and fuel prices soaring. Many governments would cushion the blow of this, but having borrowed heavily during the pandemic, along with interest rates rising, many are unable to do so. So this is really aggravating the pre-existing tensions that many countries have, making unrest more likely. This is bad news since civil unrest has already been building for several years. A good study that illustrates this well is the Global Peace Index, calculating that 84 countries have become less peaceful since 2008, and only 77 have improved. Violent protests are also up 50% over this same period, which means that when we've got a country that is precarious, it could be tipped over the edge by this global economic storm. Take Pakistan, for example, where squeezed living standards help explain why in April, Parliament ousted the Prime Minister Imran Khan with just a nod from the army. He's since led mass rallies to get his job back. In India, protests erupted over a plan to reduce the number of jobs for life in the army. I do get it, when times are hard, people are craving job security, so I'm not too shocked. Sri Lanka gives a taste of how quickly things can also spiral out of control. The president banned the use of agrochemicals last year, forcing farmers to go organic. Naturally, harvest plunged, and 6 months later, even though he lifted the ban, there was too little hard currency to import any chemical fertilizers. So on May the 19th, protests erupted. They pushed buses into lakes, set them on fire. They smashed up a museum dedicated to the president's family. The situation has calmed down now, but Sri Lankans are still furious. The shop shelves are bare, even for the basics, and people queue for hours for petrol. Schools and government offices are temporarily closed, so the situation there is really quite dire and could flare up in any moment. So this just really demonstrates how our economic situation today is really driving civil unrest. It highlights the systemic nature of the risk and how a situation of a country can change quite rapidly. As underwriters, we're becoming more mindful of this fluid risk landscape, as the situation of today really might not be the situation of tomorrow.
Thanks, Joanna and Sophia. Boy, I think it must be difficult to be an underwriter right now. So just a quick one for me to follow up on what you said is, you mentioned some scoring, some analytics, quantitative analysis. I imagine you've got to stay abreast of all the issues around the world. What do you do to underwrite risks now that you know that it may be outside city centers? It could be anywhere in the world. It could be a lot of different catalysts. Is there any certain rules, or is it just a matter of being on top of what's going on around the world as far as underwriting the risk, as far as the risk goes? And then the pricing is a different matter. I'm just curious for both of you, like what tools you use and how you actually assess these risks, which could happen almost anywhere.
Well, do you want to? I think Sophia made a good point around using IHS. I think many underwriters in the market are using this real-time tool, basically, which is assessing the risks. IHS utilize many analysts that are in country and therefore at the forefront of any changes in the risk environment. And yeah, as I just mentioned, the situation of today might not be the situation of tomorrow. So as underwriters, we're constantly having to check with what's going on via the IHS analysts. We're managing the exposures that we take onto the book through, our different aggregate management systems.
I think as well, especially kind of looking for this year in America, monitoring elections. So for example, the midterms that will be later this year, and even looking ahead to the 2024 presidential elections, that's a big kind of key determinator when assessing risk within a country.
Right, no doubt. Are there, I'll circle back to this later. I want to talk about TRIPRA as well. But are there any industries which you have seen pop up recently that have been requesting cover that you hadn't seen before? I think generally you see a lot of retail shops, right? Because that was city centers. But now that it's moved outside of city centers, has the industry diversification sort of widened out a little bit?
I think looking back at how the world was, even as say 5 years ago, we'd say that, you know, in Western Europe, usually the buying pattern of clients was sort of more geared towards, you know, your more basic terrorism and sabotage insurance only. And what we've seen, you know, as global peace has declined, as civil unrest has increased, we've seen clients actually in regions that would just focus predominantly on sort of the more elementary types of cover before, and now requesting that kind of full political violence inclusive of SRCC. So it's not really kind of the occupancy types that are changing, but more the kind of cover that clients want to protect their assets against.
Got it.
I think, well, there's been a real kind of increase in clients worrying about their business interruption, be that contingent business interruption or straight business interruption. There's been a huge increase there.
And that makes sense, especially given the duration of some of these events. I'm going to circle back to Zoe now, and I do want to come back to the TRIPRA discussion, so we'll get to that later. But Zoe, a lot of the work you do, I know, is dovetailing the coverages in PV, political violence, with property programs. Could you just talk a little bit about that and some of the challenges that you see in that exercise over the years?
Yeah, absolutely. What we've done is we've helped either cedents or clients to achieve a kind of blend, because a property program is not designed as a PV program. It's not suitably, it doesn't have suitable definitions in. It's designed as an all-risk program. So we blend the PV causes of loss. We also harmonize the exclusions. We make sure that we sit on a difference in conditions, difference in limits basis to any sub-limits. So for any crossover, if there is a crossover of strikes, riots and civil commotion, there is never a double insurance situation created. When we start to help a client with their political violence, the first thing we always ask them for is to show us the exclusions in their property policy, because it is all about the exclusions. So it's about dovetailing and wrapping around exactly what the client has in order to make sure that there are no gaps and no grey areas. And that is really important. And I think there is more work to be done in the area of bespoke wordings. There are some very standard market wordings which are used a lot of the time, but I think there's also a lot of space for different wordings for either different situations, or wordings, for example, that blend traditional property damage and business interruption with, say, non-damage business interruption. We're hearing a lot more about malicious attack, active assailant. So those kind of attacks where there are no political, religious, ideological motivations. So there is always work to be done about blending products, blending wordings, in order to make sure that a client doesn't get an off-the-peg product. Because I think that's really important, because no two property programs are the same. And I firmly believe that no two political violence programs, whether they are standalone or whether they are crafted to wrap specifically around the property program, they must start with the exclusions and work from there.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you. And I think that might lead into TRIPRA a little bit. I think, Joanna, you might be taking this topic, but the differences between what you and the wider PV market can offer versus what the government program in the US has to offer. Can we talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so obviously since the Act was passed, TRIPRA, and reinstated into TRIPRA, it was TRIA before, there hasn't actually been a single certified event in the US, which may come as a surprise, because when you look back at kind of the events that have happened in the US over the past sort of, 5-10 years, we've seen the Boston Marathon bombings, for example. We've seen the Black Lives Matter protests, which Sophia touched on earlier, and we've seen the sort of storming of the Capitol building. And what is the reason for this? Well, in order for TRIPRA to pay out, the events must be certified. So in order for this to happen, there's got to be a property or casualty loss exceeding $5 million. But not only that, the event has to pass through the Secretary of State, the Treasury, and the Attorney General. And if it's decided that an act is certified, then a loss will be paid. But obviously, if it's not certified, then the client could be left without cover, which is kind of where the standalone market comes in, to be able to offer sort of non-certified coverage, being able to protect our clients against a situation. Because if you're looking back to the Boston Marathon bombings, there was a significant amount of property damage and associated business interruption, but clients were left without cover because the event was not certified. So yeah, options and coverage can be found in the standalone market to help protect clients for this.
I think as well, just adding to that, with TRIPRA you have to buy it across your whole portfolio, whereas when you come to the standalone market, you can buy terrorism, SRCC, PV cover on single locations, and we look at it on a single location basis. It isn't a percentage of what you pay for all risk kind of looked at towards TRIPRA. It is, we price it up individually based on the location, based on the limit. So it's priced very differently as well, which can be favourable.
And I guess when we're looking at how the nature of the risk has changed, since 9/11, obviously, we've had that declinature in global peace and the uprisings, the civil unrest that we've seen, all over the world. We had the Hong Kong riots, Chile, South Africa, France, Colombia, all issues we've discussed earlier. And obviously, given these perils are not classified as terrorism and sabotage, they form, part of our wider peril spectrum, these wouldn't be covered. So therefore, there's almost an argument to say, if we look at how the risk has changed, it's more relevant and for a client to actually be looking at the more comprehensive suite of products rather than just relying on the terrorism state-backed pool.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And the wider the peril spectrum, the better for the client, right? And there have been a number of questions from the audience, and some of them are around pricing and how do you price and what does this cost? Could you talk a little bit about limits and pricing? I think this could be also for Zoe too, but let's start with Joanna and Sophia. So given that it's a fluid situation in many countries and these events take place quickly, the policies could be a year, maybe longer. What kind of pricing, how do you price it? What kind of pricing, I'm not going to say give me a rate, but how do you price it? And then how do you adjust it when things happen? And then secondly, what kind of limits are in the market right now for this type of cover? How much can you build? That might be more of a question for Zoe, I think. But let's start with the pricing first with you guys.
So when we look at underwriting a risk, we look at two main factors: the occupancy of that risk and what kind of coverage they're looking for. So sort of as Zoe touched on earlier, and as we've all discussed, you have sort of terrorism and sabotage, which is considered the most elementary type of cover, and then the perils build up, SRCC, and then political violence, including war. So I guess first things first is what coverage the client is looking to buy. What is the assets? Is it an energy plant? Is it a group of shops? Because that really drives the price. For example, as we mentioned earlier, covering sort of those retail assets against SRCC and PV is going to be a lot higher price than covering an energy plant for terrorism in Norway. So those are some factors that we have to consider when analysing and pricing for the risk.
I think as well, it's about aggregation of risk. So a hotel in New York is going to cost a lot more to insure than a hotel in the middle of Oklahoma, purely based on the fact that there's more limited capacity within the market to cover that. Also taking into account that there is a higher risk factor within New York than kind of middle of nowhere Oklahoma. So that's kind of one of the main drivers as well. But as mentioned earlier, we do utilize tools such as IHS, which provide us with risk indexes, and they kind of look ahead, but they can also show us what's happened before, and they are quite reactive. So yeah, we do see policies typically run for 12 months. So you kind of price it at that time, and a lot can change the next day after you bind, but each day, yeah, we look at it every day.
Yeah, fair enough. It is fluid, and I guess those services provide you with live updates, right? So you can monitor things throughout the year. Good. Maybe Zoe, how much capacity is there in the market? I mean, if you have a really large risk, let's say a single risk, how much can you get right now? And has that changed in recent months with potential reinsurance concerns?
Gosh, that's a huge question to answer in the time we've got left. So I'm going to try and be fairly brief. The Lloyd's market certainly is extremely vibrant and alive. And because it's always been a syndication market, it's always been a market where if you have a large risk, you will have a panel of underwriters underwriting that risk. So in my experience, gone are the days where somebody puts down $100 million line or 100% line, or, underwriters are more likely to be even more invested in the syndication method of underwriting. So you see underwriters putting down, say, 10%, 5%, those kind of things. Now, the big programs I work on, it is true to say that underwriters, in my experience, are facing reinsurance restrictions. And that is all to do with what's happening in Ukraine and the fact that gradually throughout the year, all the different direct markets that I use, their reinsurance treaties are renewing. And things have got tricky on the reinsurance side. But we can still do big programs. But what I'm starting to see is more sharing of risk with clients. So more building up of a program where you would have layers, but not 100% insured. So you may have a 50% insured layer and a 50% self-insured retention, something like that. So this is really the time to start getting creative. There's nothing like a hard market to make you really work out how things can be done. And I think with discussions with clients and making sure that everybody understands the state of the market, it's still a very, very vibrant place. And it's still a market that you can go into and you will have people that will quote a risk and people that won't. It's a real melting pot of different views. And we've talked about IHS. There are different analytics that other syndicates use. And even within that, it's always up to the human. There's still a lot of human interaction in the way these kind of programs are written. So an underwriter can take the analytics and interpret them in a completely different way to another underwriter. So if I'm building a 600 million program, then, as I've said, there will be more client participation than there would have been maybe previously, but some might say that's a good thing. Risk sharing is very healthy, and everything needs to be constructed and done in a very kind of open. I mean, I always start off with a pad of paper and draw boxes and arrows, and that is the best way to do it. So in answer to your question, there is a lot of capacity in the market. There really is. The market is very lively. Yes, there are differences, and yes, we're in what we would call a hard market, but a hard market just means the brokers have to work harder. It doesn't mean it's hard as in things are not available. The political violence market is really stepping up and responding, constantly innovating new products. So it's a really vibrant, it's a good time to be in the market. I always fly the flag for Lloyd's, basically. There's no other insurance market like it. And if a broker has to fill a risk with getting lines of 5 million from every single underwriter, then so be it. It's just the way the market happens. These things happen in cycles, but the capacity is there, the willingness is there. It's a question of bringing the right people together to create the right kind of risk sharing agreement.
Great, that's good to hear. In the end of the day, we're here for claims, right? So there's a question on how difficult it is to adjust claims in these classes of business. And I think, when I think of how difficult claims are to adjust, I think of, especially in war, right? How do you get in there to see what was damaged? Maybe Zoe, you could start, and if Joanna and Sophia want to add to it, the claims process, how does it work? How difficult is it?
Claims are always unique. So there is obviously a standard process, but again, it's not a one size fits all situation. the kind of claims that I am personally seeing at the moment are usually to do with what's happening in Ukraine, and where a loss adjuster can't necessarily go to Ukraine. Most of the loss adjusters seem to be meeting in Poland, seems to be where a lot of people in the insurance industry have kind of decamped to, and that's really how loss adjusters do the work. You can also buy coverage where you can cover constructive total loss, where you can't get a loss adjuster in. That's also available in the market. So that's, another way that the market is developing, because if you could find me a loss adjuster who would go into Ukraine right now, I'd be very surprised. But claims are still being adjusted. When it's obvious that something has been damaged and it's gone, monies are paid on account. Underwriters are really, like you said, Evan, we are here to pay claims. Underwriters are here to pay claims. And, underwriters are here to support their clients. So I think even if there is a situation where an underwriter or a loss adjuster rather can't get into a territory, then accommodations can and will be made by the market in general. I don't know what you think, Joanna and Sophia, on that point.
Well, I think when we look at the development of technology, I did read somewhere that they've sent some drones actually to investigate damaged sites. So yeah, I think technology allows that loss adjusting to occur even when the loss adjusters can't get to the site themselves. So I think that advancements in technology will only improve.
I also think as well, it's about collaboration. So we all have a dedicated claim specialist within our syndicates. But an example is Black Lives Matter, working out the business interruption for a number of the insureds that had losses from the event was incredibly difficult due to COVID. So trying to untangle what losses they had from the protests versus what losses they had from being shut down due to COVID and the business interruption that ensued then was incredibly challenging. So by being open and transparent with each other, that really helped to kind of enable the claims outcome.
And I imagine a lot of the losses, especially in those types of claims, or Black Lives Matter, where there were protests which could have been peaceful. Sometimes there was theft and vandalism, which may have been on the property program. It's probably important to make sure that the policies dovetail really well, right? And I think that's been I've seen the market really develop in that area in recent years.
Yes, you can have looting coverage within our market, within the SRCC wording.
Good. We have a few questions left, but I wanted to make sure we covered off a little bit about how Lloyd's differentiates itself, and kind of like a why Lloyd's discussion. Now, I know Zoe talked about its relationship-based, et cetera, but Sophia and Joanna, just generally, like, what are your differentiators when you're looking to get business? Obviously, relationship-based and price means something, but how does Lloyd stand out versus the rest of the market to win business?
I think Lloyd has always been at the forefront of kind of product innovation, wordings. And so I think that Lloyd's really is the center and the expertise. It's sort of where our market was born in Lloyd's. I think over the past kind of 10 years, we've seen business gravitate away from Lloyd's. But I think in difficult times, and as we're kind of in a period of market shift, people's capacities are reducing, the market's hardening. I do think that, coming into that central Lloyd's market for the expertise, for that agility in product wordings, I think that, that's only beneficial for clients.
I think as well at Inigo, one of our core values is called Get Smart. And we really just want to get to know who the client is, what they want, just so we can be there to help them in the best way possible. And we share that across the other syndicates within Lloyd's. As Zoe mentioned, it is syndicated. We all support each other. We share the risk, which is very unlike other markets.
Is it fair, Zoe, I'll go to you in a minute, but is it fair to say that the market is moving a bit more towards manuscripted solutions and away from some of these facilities where, it was a one size fits all? Is that true?
I think that's definitely fair to say. As we've touched on a lot of the points that we've kind of seen across the world in terms of climate change, social inflation, things that are really moving the kind of the geopolitical sphere. And from that, we're seeing individual clients coming in with different needs. So it has to be kind of a case by case policy rather than just manuscript forms.
Great. And Zoe, I know you're very evangelical about this, about you want to look at everyone's property policy wordings to make sure you can help them plug the gaps and make the client understand that they need to protect themselves. So I'd like to give you a couple of minutes to talk about some of that work and how Lloyd's fits into that, right, on innovation, et cetera.
Okay. Well, actually, one thing I would say is, and I'm not sure if we've covered it, is that our policies are absolutely non-cancelable. So if you write a risk and something happens, the underwriters cannot and do not walk away. Well, that is a key differentiator, I think, between us and some other markets. So that's really important. I've talked a little bit about how you can really start thinking about innovating wordings in order to work for clients. So if you have a claims experience, you learn from them. So claims experience means, right, well, this happened in this situation. Maybe this loss was paid, maybe it wasn't. If it wasn't, how can I create structure in a wording that means that it will be covered the next time? Or how can I make sure that the loss adjustment process works better? So when you have the right kind of people to bounce this off and talk about it with, it kind of links in with what Sophia was saying about, you know, nothing needs to be manuscripted. Nothing needs to be off the shelf. Everything can be manuscripted, free-formed. It's so important to know that a retailer is not like a chicken farmer or an oil refinery, and there's no reason why their insurance program should look the same. So you need to, I believe that brokers and underwriters need to work together to really push the innovation. If a client has had a problem on a previous claim, you look at it and you say, right, how could we make sure this doesn't happen again? Now, history doesn't always repeat itself. The past is no guide to the future, etc. But, you know, we should never rest on our laurels, right? We should always keep striving to improve and to change and to innovate. And I think that that's what Lloyd's actually does really well. And actually with Talbot and Inigo, I have to say we've done some of the best innovation that I'm really proud of. So that's really where you need to cut me off, Evan, because I'll start talking and we'll still be here at midnight, and I'm sure nobody wants that.
No, it's great. I mean, I think it's amazing how when large claims or even small claims in the market occur, you learn something every time. And I guess it goes under the you don't know what you don't know, right? When these things happen, then we can adjust wordings, we can innovate new wordings, we can protect against perils that we didn't foresee. So all the work that you're doing with the market's been great to watch. We don't have any more open questions, at least those that we can answer on the board. So I thought it might be good to wrap it up now and just to say thank you again to Lloyd's America. Thank you, Joanna, Sophia, and Zoe. I hope everyone enjoyed the conversation. I know I did. So thanks for everything today. Pat, back to you.
Sure. Thanks, Evan. And I'm sure our audience will join me in giving a big thank you to our panelists and for sharing their time with us today. It was, as always, a fascinating discussion, and we could probably go on for a lot longer. But that will do it for us today. Be sure to mark your calendars for our next session on July 26th, when our focus will be marine. Our guests will be Louise Foley from Markel International, Philip Furlong from IQUW Syndicate, and Ian Greenway, president of LIG Marine Managers. As our session ends today, please take a few moments to complete the feedback questions that will appear in your browser. We, as always, greatly value your input, and we always look forward to hearing from you with any comments, suggestions, or program ideas. So please feel free to drop us a note anytime at usevents@lloyds.com. So until the 26th, let's all stay connected, and we hope you have a great rest of your week.